The movie begins by introducing our protagonist Eric Black, a Scottish man in his 30s who is a widower. He is depressed and still mourning the passing of his wife. Eric Black sits at his kitchen table and sees a drawer in his kitchen open on its own. A tiny hand, like that of an infant, comes out of the drawer, then quickly disappears. When Eric Black goes over to the drawer to shut it, he sees his wife's ultrasound photo of her unborn baby. Eric sits back down and looks at the job classifieds section of the newspaper and notices a wanted ad for a shepherd to watch a herd of sheep on a Scottish island. Eric thinks about this idea. Perhaps he thinks it would be good for him to get away from his house with all the memories of his wife and throw himself into a new job. The scene then changes to Eric driving in his car with his dog Buster. Eric drives for what seems like a long time, passing vast expanses of farmland. He arrives at an old cottage and knocks on the door. His mother answers the door, but she is less than happy to see him. She immediately brings up Eric's deceased wife, that he is only there now because she is gone, and she doesn't know how he can stand what she did to him, about how she cheated on him. Eric doesn't want to talk about it, and his mother rejects his request to come in and catch up. She is angry at him, that he left her there and hasn't looked after her. He decides to leave, and then his mother asks where he will be going, and he defensively tells her not to worry about it. Eric gets in his car and drives away. Next, we see Eric Black drive to a secluded area in the moors and pull his wedding ring off. He gets to his knees in anguish and gets out a pocket knife, opens it, and lays it against his wrist, battling with the idea of. At the last minute, he pulls back the knife and cries bitterly, overcome with emotions. When he looks up, he sees a lone black sheep looking at him, and this reminds Eric of his idea to take the job as a shepherd and start a new chapter in his life. Eric gets on a boat to travel with a Scottish lady named Fisher to a remote Scottish island, where he will be caretaking the sheep. Fisher tries to make conversation with Eric on the way, and asks if his wife will be joining him. He doesn't say anything, only shakes his head. Fisher asks if Eric is escaping or running away from something, and Eric tells her he needs the work. Fisher cryptically asks him how the ad found him. He is a little confused by this question, and tells her that he saw it in the paper. She then asks again, how did it find him? Eric says abruptly that sometimes people just need solitude. Once they arrive, Eric and Fisher walk up past the lighthouse, which makes a bell ringing sound. Fisher explains to him that it's for the fog, but that the lighthouse light stopped working many years ago. Fisher points up to the old cottage that Eric will be living in, and explains that there are plenty of lanterns, wood for the fire, and a telephone for emergencies. However, it plays up during bad weather. She says he's got everything he needs, and then turns to leave. Eric, feeling a bit nervous about being left alone so early, asks her if she is leaving, and when she will be back. She turns around to face him again, to tell him she will be back next Tuesday with more supplies, and anything else he might need. She reminds him he has sheep to find. The instructions are all in his map, and he will not be short of chores. She shakes his hand to say goodbye. But when she does, she makes a strange, intuitive comment that she feels something is haunting him, and she hopes he gets a chance to confront it while he is out there. She turns to leave again, and then whips around again, forgetting she meant to give him a journal and tells him to keep it safe somewhere. With that, she turns and leaves. Now Eric is alone in a very lonely place, with just Baxter, his border collie, as his companion. Eric enters the old cottage and takes stock of the place that will be his home from now on. It is extremely run down and barely keeps the cold out due to gaps and broken down areas of the cottage. He tries the phone, but it doesn't work, and decides to sweep out the dust and make a cup of tea on the old stove. He gets out his food items, including a nice looking mug that is pink and green, which probably belonged to his deceased wife. Later, Eric goes outside, follows the map and goes to collect some water for him and Baxter. When he finds the water, he sees a piece of jewelry in the water and fishes it out. It's his wedding ring on a necklace. He stares at it for a while, then puts it in his coat pocket. When he gets back to the cottage, he gets the ring out and moves as if to put it on, and then he gets a flashback for a split second of him traveling along a road. This flashback must have something to do with his deceased wife, as it deters him from putting his wedding ring back on. Later, Eric feeds the sheep, but he is so overwhelmed by the amount that he doesn't bother to count them as he should. After feeding them, he returns to the cottage to check out the generator, and it's broken. He kicks it a few times, but it doesn't work. He looks out and notices Baxter staring at the lighthouse, and he walks over to him and pets him reassuringly. Nighttime on the island is eerie and lonely. At around 12:30, Eric steps outside and sees no sign of civilization, and looks up at the vast expanse of stars, feeling acutely alone and insignificant. He heads back inside. Inside the kitchen, he starts to read the journal that was left from the previous shepherd, and notices some disturbing entries. He talks of a witch, and that she is here. He shuts the journal, and then looks at the clock, which says it is around 2 in the morning. He decides to go upstairs to bed, however he struggles with a phobia of heights. He tells himself he needs to get over it, and walks painstakingly slowly up the stairs and into the bedroom. Baxter takes some encouraging to follow him, and when he gets there, Baxter stares at the door, wanting to go out again. Eric hears the lighthouse bells and tries to go to sleep. He has difficulty doing so, because it begins to rain and thunder and the house makes all sorts of loud noises. When he finally does manage to fall asleep, he dreams of his deceased wife asking him to drive up to the mountains with her, but he doesn't want to. She asks if it's because he is still afraid of heights, to which he says no. She repeatedly asks why, and he just says no. He wakes up from the dream and walks downstairs, as it is morning. He puts the kettle on, but then turns around, puzzled, as he notices a freshly brewed mug of tea sitting on the kitchen table. He dismisses it and heads outside to watch the ocean. It is quite windy, and he just watches the vast body of water. Baxter is running around, and he calls him to follow him as he goes to feed the sheep. He pours the pellets in for the sheep, and then hears a very loud, strange noise like a metallic twisting sound that he cannot tell where it comes from. He yells out, asking who is there, but nobody replies. The sheep all stop and stare at him without moving, which disturbs Eric, so he calls Baxter to follow him back home. When he gets into the cottage, he sees the tea mug he saw this morning sitting on the kitchen table, but there is noticeable fresh lipstick on the brim of the mug. He pours it out and then smashes it into a bucket, breaking it. At this stage, Eric Black is starting to regret his decision to move out here as a remote caretaker shepherd. He knows he is seeing things that don't make sense. He tries the phone, but it doesn't work. He collects some wood outside and then looks over at the lighthouse. To his surprise, he sees Fisher, the lady who took him out here, carrying a sack of something into the lighthouse and then walking away back to her dinghy. Eric yells at the top of his lungs repeatedly to get her attention, but she does not notice him. He yells more and starts to approach, but he is too far away, and she is already moving away from the shore. Eric runs over to the lighthouse to try and get in, but the door is locked. Later that night, he stands at the bottom of the stairs again, ready to go to bed, struggling with the same fear of their height. He tells himself to get a grip, walks up them, and sits on his bed for a while. Baxter starts to growl at the wardrobe, and Eric asks Baxter if he's seen any birds, because he hasn't seen any himself. That night he dreams of his deceased wife Rachel, out in the fields of the island where he is. She is wearing a red dress, and he follows her. Rachel is looking at something behind him, and he turns around to see a dark, cloaked figure holding a large lantern. He runs backwards away from it, closer to where Rachel is standing, but when he turns around, the black figure is right in front of him. He wakes with a fright. It's morning now, and Eric walks downstairs and is quite shocked to see his mother in the kitchen. She is making breakfast, and talks to Eric about his disgraceful wife, and calls her horrible names because of her drinking and sleeping around. Eric is still confused with how she got there, and is speechless. His mother walks over to the sink, and starts to slice continuously with a kitchen knife. Blood pours into the sink. She then turns around and approaches Eric, getting closer and closer, and her face contorts into a hideous and grotesque face. Eric wakes up with a fright again, realizing the whole thing has been a dream. Eric catches his breath, and then when he looks around he realizes the bedroom door is ajar and Baxter has gone missing. He tries the phone, and this time it works. He rings Fisher and tells her Baxter is missing, and she tells him to go out and look for him. Eric hangs up the phone and goes out to look for him in the fields and calls out to him, but he does not come back. Eventually, he comes across a very bizarre scene. Right before his eyes is a very large old ship that has been washed up on the field. It looks as if it has been there for decades. He enters the old ship, thinking Baxter could have explored in there. He looks everywhere, but he isn't there. Suddenly, behind him he senses a very large presence. It is the same cloaked black figure from his dream the night before, and he walks away very slowly from the figure at first, and then runs away from the ship once he gets back outside. He runs home and barricades the door with a chair. As he sits there staring at the door, he holds a knife and continually flicks a metal lighter that used to belong to Rachel. He starts to have flashbacks of the days she passed, only seconds long, traveling along a road near a cliff. He then hears bird-like noises coming from the closet beside the front door, and he approaches it with his knife ready, but when he opens it he sees a little stuffed bird with buttons for eyes. He gets annoyed about how frightened he is of everything, and he marches back out to the fields, determined to find Baxter, and heads back to where he saw the shipwreck. When he gets there, he laughs hysterically, because there is nothing there. When Eric gets home he manically writes notes in the journal, and doesn't realize that it's late until he stops. It's after 2 in the morning. He grabs the other journal from the previous caretaker off of the shelf. He begins to read, and becomes alarmed when he sees notes on the lighthouse. And when he turns the page he sees a detailed sketch of his dog Baxter. He is so shocked that he throws the journal away from him on the floor, and then picks it up and burns it in the fire. He falls asleep in the chair for a while and then wakes up. The emergency phone starts to ring. He picks it up slowly, and it's Fisher on the other end. He asks her where he is, and Fisher won't answer him directly, and she tells him that only Eric can figure out why he is where he is, and surely by now he must know. Eric starts to break down, and tells Fisher he didn't do anything wrong. It was an accident. Fisher can tell he is talking about his wife Rachel's end of life. He explains he had been drinking, and they were driving along a road, and he lost control and went over a cliff. Fisher could tell there was another that passed, not just his wife, and Eric admits that yes, there was a baby. Rachel's unborn baby. Fisher tells him it's time to begin his sentence. Eric finds the key to the lighthouse from the journal, and decides to explore it. The lighthouse stairs are a long way up, and he battles with every step, feeling extremely afraid. There are bird corpses littered along the steps, and there are many stuffed birds with their eyes missing. Meanwhile, out on the boat, not far from the island, Fisher is putting button eyes into a taxidermied raven. She shakes her head in disbelief as she sees the light is working on the lighthouse again, and realizes that Eric has made his way inside and fixed it. Eric makes his way back down the stairs of the lighthouse, trying to avoid all the stuffed birds, then sees a spider which spooks him, and he trips and falls the rest of the way down the stairs, hitting his head at the bottom. As he gets out of the lighthouse to face towards home, he comes to a standstill and is horrified by what he sees. Impaled on sticks and skinned and gutted are all of the sheep he was meant to caretake, and what is worse, his dog Baxter has been murdered the same way. He runs back inside and hides in the house. Eric falls asleep and has another dream with flashbacks of Rachel. He sees an infant under the ice and uses a bucket to break the glass, but in the process ends the and blood spurts out everywhere. Eric wakes up abruptly, breathing heavy. The flashbacks of Rachel and the baby are now becoming more and more frequent. His past is catching up with him, and he can't get away from the truth of what's happened. As he sits there, he hears the sound of a motor running and looks out of his window. He sees Fisher's boat. He goes to turn for the doorway, but a hideous black figure covered in seaweed stands there. It approaches him, and he becomes extremely frightened. The figure lifts the hood back off its face, revealing it to be his deceased wife Rachel. She has no pupils in her eyes, and her skin is pale and sickly. She continuously asks why, and Eric shakes his head in disbelief. He repeats to her that Rachel is gone, and he let her go. He then yells at her that she is not his wife, flicks the lighter on, and throws it at the puddle of fuel she is standing in, that he knocked over when he awoke from his nightmare. She screams as she catches on fire, and she disintegrates. Eric runs out of the cottage and runs towards the boat. He doesn't care about getting into the cold water, and swims his way towards the boat frantically. He is almost to the boat when he starts to struggle to stay afloat. He takes in a bit of water and he starts to sink down. He becomes still, sinking down further, until he suddenly snaps out of the trance-like state he was in, and then swims towards the surface. As he is going, his deceased wife Rachel grabs his ankle and tries to pull him back down. Some time later, he is found washed up on the beach by two men and their dog. Next, we see that Eric is now in a building and being interviewed by a healthcare worker or a social worker, trying to understand where he came from and if he can remember anything. She manages to get his name, Eric Black, and asks him what else he remembers so she can help him. At first, he doesn't speak much, but eventually he confesses to her that he ended his wife's life. The car they were driving in was on a precipice. He knew that if he left the car, it would topple over, with her weight being on the cliffside, and he got out anyway. He walked out, and the car fell to the beach below, onto the rocks. He cries bitterly from the memories, and he says to the woman interviewing him that he did everything for Rachel and wondered why everything was not enough for her. The woman asks if there is anything else that he needs to tell her. With tears in his eyes, Eric tells her that she was pregnant. The woman comforts Eric, understanding he has been through a lot, and she suggests taking a break. She lets him know that there is a phone in the corner in case he would like to call anyone. Just as she exits the room, it begins to ring, and to Eric's horror, he notices it is the exact same phone that was in the cottage on the island. He walks over to it warily and picks up the receiver. Fisher speaks on the other end of the phone line, telling him that he can't run from fate. He can't run from what he has done. She implies the police have his journals, and we see that Fisher visited his mother too. Fisher is the one that exacts punishment on him. He thought before that he was in a sealed room, but when he looks over, the door to get out looks just like an old door in the cottage on the island. He hears the wind move through the gap at the bottom of the door. He opens the door and finds he is back on the island. It is as if Eric Black is in his own isolated world of hell, running from the guilt of what he did to his wife Rachel. The end.